Anti-capitalist movements are spreading throughout Europe. Some are targeting banks. Others say the whole economic system is rotten. But what exactly do they stand for? We'll be finding out. Hello and welcome to A Simple Question with me, Phil Rees. Neoliberalism, or unregulated capitalism, the political ideology that has dominated our planet for nearly 3 decades, is now failing. But what is there to replace it? And in nations suffering a debt crisis, elected politicians have been replaced by technocrats. What does that tell us about the relative power of international finance and our democracies? Well, before we find out what the people think here on the streets of London, here's a short video clip.
Anti-capitalist movements have been formed throughout Europe in the wake of the Occupy Wall Street protests. They brought together broad sections of society who feel disenfranchised from the political system. In Britain, the post-war social contract between labour and capital was dismantled and replaced with the market-driven approach to economic and social policy, which emphasised private enterprise and free trade. For the first time in a century, the gap between rich and poor began to increase. The top 1% of wage earners saw their wealth rise dramatically. 20 years ago, the average chief executive of a FTSE 100 company earned 17 times the average employee's pay. Now it is more than 75 times. In order to receive loan deferrals and a reduction in its debt, international monetary bodies forced the Greek parliament to throw out one prime minister and approve a new government under Lucas Papademos, a technocrat and former deputy chief of the European Central Bank. Similarly, in Italy, Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi was proving to be an obstacle for what financiers wanted to do. Investors sent Italy's cost of borrowing up towards crisis levels, and by the end of that week, Berlusconi finished. The markets had spoken, and they also didn't like the idea of democracy. Berlusconi's replacement is the former EU Commissioner Mario Monti, an advisor of Goldman Sachs and also a leading member of the Bilderberg Group. The Nobel-winning economist Paul Krugman noted recently in the New York Times, "We have a society in which money is increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few people, and in which that concentration of income and wealth threatens to make us a democracy in name only."
A Simple Question is a show that finds out what the public thinks here on the streets of London. I began today by asking what people knew about the anti-capitalist movements in Europe and why they'd become so popular so quickly.
Largely about the demonstrations and what I've read in the newspapers and heard on the radio, and that's about it.
I know that basically they're springing up across Europe in all European countries, largely in response to the current economic global recession.
What do you know about the anti-capitalist movements that have grown up in Europe, and why did they emerge?
Not a lot, I'm afraid. What's in Europe, I noticed that the French are against the Germans against us, but that's all I noticed, which I think is very bad.
Just traveling to London Bridge, I've seen on St. Paul, they have Occupy, probably London Stock Exchange or City, and lots of people are protesting against probably raising interest rates in banks and so on.
I know I've heard of a few taking place on Wall Street and in London and in Europe, so I've heard a bit about student protests and the like.
What do you know about the protest movements, the anti-capitalist movements that have grown up in Europe?
Well, I know that in Greece at the moment there are problems because the government's cutting spending and people don't want that to happen. I know at the moment in London people are anti-capitalist because they feel that they're not getting their fair share in the bankers, that it's all going to the top 1% and the banks are getting all the income and other people aren't getting any money.
Well, I know the one in London, there was outside St. Paul's Cathedral, and I know about one in New York, but I didn't know there were other ones in Europe.
Why do you think they've emerged?
Because I understand why they've emerged, because, I mean, the banks have made this mess and the people at the top banks still getting paid.
I guess one factor is the 2008 global crisis, because many people believe it to be a result of repercussion of capitalist system of economy.
I think it's pretty obvious, really. We've seen apparent failure of the capitalist system right from the top downwards, and people are looking for reasons, they're looking for excuses, they're looking for someone to blame, but they're also looking for solutions.
Why do you think it spread so quickly throughout Europe?
Because I think it's sort of like a universal issue. All the countries are feeling the same, and once people see other people protesting, they feel that they can do it as well.
Oh, God knows, I couldn't answer that one. Just a question of the financial situation everywhere, and they're doing this bit extra that they believe in would help, and that's about as far as I can say on the subject, because I don't think anyone's got the answer, have they?
Different views there from the public here on the streets of London. Let's now find out what our experts think.
I think it's very interesting to look at that and to see that no one event really sparked it off instantly. It was a delayed reaction. It took some time, perhaps, for the impact, certainly of the banking crisis, and it goes back all to the collapse of Lehman Brothers and the knock-on effect that had on British banks and other banks across Europe. But it didn't happen immediately. It wasn't straight afterwards. I think it was gradually, as the impact of those big collapses of banks and financial institutions impacted on ordinary people, on their ways of life, people decided to make a gesture, and it moved on from there. But it didn't happen instantly, and it's difficult. You can look and say that with the Middle East uprisings, the Arab Spring, no one thing sparked it immediately, but once it's happened, it's very difficult to hold it back, and I think that's what we've seen. And history, they'll write history books as to what caused it and what was the trigger and events for them. I think we're now in an age, and it may be a short period age, but over the last few years, where it's not just the internet which allows things to move very quickly, it's people's obsessions with mobile phones, with Twitter, and with information being sent on the social media accounts. And that goes not just, a few years ago people might have been ringing up their friends and saying, come on, let's go down, we're going to have a demonstration, or working things out over a period. Now, messages can be sent over the internet, by text message, by Twitter, and you've got no idea to whom they're necessarily going, and they go to lots and lots of different people.
I see them as emerging, particularly among the young people, in response to the system that created the present crisis, and in response to the way in which the present crisis, the policies that are being implemented to deal with the present crisis. Now, I should say that my take on this is that the deregulated financial system, the way in which it was operating, was penalising hugely young people. It involved a hugely regressive redistribution of income and wealth from young people to older people, and from people who have relatively few assets, immigrant workers and so on, to older people older middle class people, propertied people. And while I can see that a lot of the middle class were more than happy with this, many of us who would count ourselves as middle class were also very distressed at what this is doing to young people. I don't think that it's united. I think that it's picking up on a number of issues, but it's not united around any one particular outlook or solution, and not as far as I know. I mean, this comes out when they're asked for, well, what is their program, and inevitably they say, no, this isn't a program, this is a movement. And they don't have a program, but they are highlighting the very, very major inequalities that have been created by a financial system that went out of control, and now by the policies that are being used to try and resolve what's emerged as a financial crisis of the state.
Some argue that anti-capitalist protesters are just moaners with no solution to the world's economic problems. Well, are they simply angry with the banks or with a much wider economic system where injustice and exploitation are rife? Let's find out what the public thinks.
I think in England it's mainly, actually in Europe, it's mainly the banks and the bankers. So sort of global recession has led to quite a lot of anger.
I think they're targeting the obvious targets, the banks, the targets that everybody knows about, like sort of international sort of monetary fund, etc., etc. I think they're targeting our politicians, who have shown perhaps no capacity to govern whatsoever in relation to regulation of international monetary institutions, and indeed have allowed particularly private, corporate financial institutions to benefit in a way that's completely unacceptable.
Who exactly do you think these groups are targeting? Is it just, say, the banks and the elite like that, or is it more generally the economic system that's been in place for the last 30 years?
Well, I suppose what they're drawing the parallels between, aren't they, is the behaviour of the banks and the wider economic system, and how one thing leads to another. And the banks seem to be in control of the whole of the economy now, don't they? Whereas before, I think they were a smaller part of the economy. So, seems to a lot of people they've captured government.
It's a more generalised issue. It's got everything to do with, yes, capitalism, banks, but also big industry, big business, politicians, you name it. Anything that's at the top, it seems to me.
If you look at the way society seems to be based, and it does seem to be based on free market triumphalism and the capitalist movement, you're seeing the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer, and when the rich cause problems, you don't see any accountability there. And I think it's pretty clear that people are getting pretty sick of it.
Do you think these people are just targeting the banks and only the banks, or maybe the economic system as a whole?
I think they're targeting the economic system as a whole, really. I don't think just the banks. The system is flawed at the moment. I don't know why, but it is flawed, and it shouldn't be that the wealth, they're getting richer. The people are getting richer at the top, and the people at the bottom are getting poorer. So there's something wrong somewhere.
Well, I think they're targeting mainly banks, but I think they should be targeting both governments and the banks as well.
Do you think that these social and political movements reflect a deeper dissatisfaction of people towards their governments?
I think it reflects a deeper dissatisfaction of people of a certain age. I think they're primarily Gen Y, and my experience back home and around the place is Gen Y are quite dissatisfied generally. If they don't get things that they want when they want them, they get upset and complain.
Probably people are unsatisfied with their governments. I can't comment on that because I'm not from Europe, but I see the same movements in my country, and I would agree with people who try to push the government and make life easier.
Not particularly, unless the media's not covering as much. You don't hear much about it in the press.
Do you think that the anger of certain people here reflects, and under social movements that have grown, reflects a broader dissatisfaction of people with their governments?
I think it's obviously a very difficult time at the moment, economically across Western Europe. So I think the government is obviously the natural, bears the brunt of that. I think the fact that you're seeing it everywhere is the fact that we've all got ourselves into this problem en masse, I think. For the governments we elected previously and the ones we've got now. So I think it's just natural that people's anger and frustration at what is a difficult situation gets vented on governments.
I don't know. It's not just a question of us, is it? Sorting it out. We rely on so-called world markets now. So it's out of our hands completely when it regards to looking after our own financial situation, apparently. So, you know as much as I do, I think.
Wealth creation is based on people getting richer, but if some people get rich too fast, then some people are going to be getting poor too fast. So there's got to be some sort of rebalance. I'm not sure people have got all the answers, but they've got to start looking. And I think they're looking for our leaders to be more accountable.
Do you think these social and political movements reflect a broader dissatisfaction of people towards their governments?
Yes, definitely, yeah. I mean, I'm not going to sit out in a tent or anything, but I can't say I'm happy with it. And if you ask the average person who's being honest about it, I don't think they are. But it's a little bit of you sold what you see, and the government tell you one thing, and I think there's a big distrust on most government parties now.
I think people are seeing there isn't, they're really in bed with one another in a sense, and and a very, very powerful group. So it's only, I think, as people unite and come together and find a voice together that they're able to kind of stand up to that. And it's kind of a mobilising thing.
Well, those were views of people on the streets of London. Let's now find out what our experts have to say.
I think when you see at the moment we're in a period of low turnout in elections, even in this country when people are very concerned about the issues, we're not getting 85% turnout in elections, we're getting low turnouts. I mean, even last week there was an election, albeit a by-election, but there was only a 28% turnout. So people don't necessarily see at the moment that politicians have got all the answers, but they do blame them for the problems that occurred. And even if they don't blame them for the actual problems in the first place, for the collapse of the banks, they feel, with some justification I think, that the banks have not been properly regulated for long enough. You have to ask yourself, and the people of Greece and the people of Italy will be asking themselves, how did this person become Prime Minister? How did this person become a minister? What do we do if we don't like this person? What do the Italians do if they don't like Mario Monti as their Prime Minister? And how do they get rid of them if they don't like them? He wasn't elected in the first place. He was appointed by the president, perhaps with agreement of a lot of other politicians, but not necessarily with the agreement of all the people who at the moment may be happy. But it's a very dangerous sort of situation to get into, because it's the way, and quite often in countries they're happy when the military dictator takes over to calm the situation after a turbulent period, but then, as we see in Egypt at the moment, it doesn't last very long before they're unhappy about it. So if you can't control your politicians, if you've got no way of getting rid of them, it's not a democracy, and it's a dangerous precedent to set. I don't think when you look at a system where people pay more taxes for the social benefits and for a proper health service and a proper public transport system, I don't believe that people genuinely object to doing that if they think it's being run properly and they're getting the service that they like. In this country, the National Health Service is a very good example of a caring, compassionate, socialist society, which is the envy of many other countries, in that everybody can get the treatment that they want because everybody's paid into it. A few people opt out of it to try and get something else separate from themselves. But I think a system that doesn't rely on huge profits and big business and looks at the needs of the people in a more socialist, compassionate way is perfectly acceptable and has been seen to work. So capitalism is not the answer.
I think what a lot of the young people see is governments which are not responsive to their electorates. They're being forced into particular policies by the pressure of the financial markets, by the fact that the financial markets won't buy government debt unless governments follow particular policies. And the result is that there are a lot of young people who feel disenfranchised, not just economically but politically as well. They don't see a way of changing this other than making a highly visible exhibition in in capital city. The alternative to capitalism was always socialism. I mean, the practical alternative, socialism in its various guises, but in particular, what it needs is that you can have private enterprise within the framework of a socialist economy, but it needs guidance. And in particular, the capitalist system, the failure of the capitalist system arises because it periodically businesses refuse to invest. And then they need to, in some ways, to be induced to invest, and for that you need this. You need the state.
When countries in Europe have run into debt problems, their elected politicians were replaced by technocrats with links to international financial institutions. It happened in Greece. It happened in Italy when their prime ministers stood up to the financial markets. Well, does that mean that democracy is being bypassed? And also, is a planned socialist economy a viable alternative to freewheeling market capitalism? Let's find out.
I think it's inevitable that these people are going to come into power, but I see this. It's just going to be a continuation, perhaps even more sort of focused on the market and the financial markets being more and more important in that.
I've no idea, but I don't place much faith in economists as predictors of the future either, so it'll be interesting to see what happens.
European governments like Greece and Italy have put technocrats in charge, people linked to international financial institutions. Do you think that's actually undermining democracy in these countries?
I think in times of crisis, countries do what they need to do. Countries around the world are doing the same thing. In Australia, when we had a crisis, we had formed a national government back during the Second World War. Countries do what they need to do within their own democratic means, and the prime ministers of Greece and Italy, while technocrats, will be democratically elected at some point in the future, in the near future. And I think the countries need them to get them out of the mess they're in.
Yes, I do. And if one of the results of that is that we get leaders who... It depends what they're enforcing, doesn't it? Because if they're just enforcing a way of, meeting the sort of international bank's demands and making sure that all the cuts happen, then they're not leading us out of the crisis. They're leading us into another crisis, a deepening of the alienation that people feel.
Yeah, I think that's certainly a bad sign. I think our political leaders should be they should be a defence against financial leaders. They should be more like moral leaders, and they should mediate between the two. So I think that's a sign of a failed system there.
Do you think there is an alternative to the capitalist system that we have now?
The alternative is controlling the capitalist system and making, if we've got to, take a pill that's bitter to swallow as the rank and file populace of the country, then also they've got to try and find a way that these people in banking industry find a bitter pill to swallow and accept less profit. I don't know how they're going to do it, but somebody's going to have to face up and try and do it.
Probably I agree that it's good to look at countries like Norway and Sweden that really promoted socialism.
Sadly, I don't think so, because human beings are selfish by nature. So there's no better way than capitalist system, unless everybody will just want to sacrifice what they have, meaning the elites will just give off whatever they have to the poor, which I don't think will ever happen anytime soon, at least.
Do you think there is an alternative to capitalism and neoliberal economic system that exists now?
I think I don't know. I think they've got to really reflect on what's happened in the last 20 years. Because even under Labour, yes, we do need capitalism. We do need people to make money. But how much money do a lot of people need?
No, I don't think there is actually. I think the way that things are is eventually it's the people at the top who run everything, and there's not much you can do about it.
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Thanks for joining us. If you've got something to say yourself, send an email to asimplequestion@presstv.com. That's asimplequestion@presstv.com. Meanwhile, I'll see you next week. Bye-bye for now.